and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, an apology that I went through the British school system and therefore I can't speak any foreign languages. So I apologize that I'm going to be speaking in English rather than in Spanish. My second apology is for those of you who came along thinking this was going to be a presentation by Stephen King, the horror story author. I tend to specialize in real-life horror stories rather than fictional horror stories. I should also note that although you've heard about my new book, When the Money Runs Out, it's actually my second book that I've written. There's an earlier book which is called Losing Control. For any of you who are vaguely interested, you could go onto Amazon and search for Losing Control. But I wanted to give you a few words of warning, because it turns out that Losing Control is not just the title of my book, it also happens to be the title of a pornographic DVD. So be very, very careful as to what you might think about clicking on when you go onto Amazon or other websites. When the money runs out, well, of course, in a literal sense, this cannot be true, because we know that central banks can print as much money as they wish to. And so what I mean when I say when the money runs out, it's more a sort of turn of phrase, the idea that the Western world just isn't feeling quite as rich, quite as affluent as it has done over the last few decades, that in effect we've made promises to ourselves built on an extrapolation of the rapid growth rates of the late 20th century, and we're discovering that those promises cannot easily be met, because actually the growth rates we've seen in recent years have been nothing like the growth rates we hoped to see. Now, I'm aware that in Spain you're very familiar with this experience in recent times, but it's also true of many other countries as well. I'll give you an example. Actually, it's the UK, so I'm speaking here rather selfishly because it's my country rather than other countries, but the UK in one sense captures this story of changes in growth rates decade by decade. This actually is an important year for me, partly because of the publication of the book, but also because I celebrate, in just a few days' time, in fact, a particularly important birthday. It's not my 30th birthday. Don't laugh. It's not my 40th birthday, and it's not my 60th birthday either. It's sort of the one in between. And I was thinking about how the UK economy has changed over the last 50 years, through my lifetime so far. I'm thinking about the changes in living standards decade by decade, and it really is quite a remarkable story. So in the first decade of my life, from 63 to 73, there was an increase in British living standards of almost 40%. 40% in just 10 years, a really very impressive performance. And other countries are doing quite a lot better than the UK. In the second decade, from 73 to 83, there was an increase in living standards of only 13%. But there were lots of good reasons why the numbers were so weak, mostly associated with the oil shocks of 73 and 79, and then, of course, the very deep global recession that we saw at the beginning of the 1980s. In the third decade, from 83 to 93, there was an increase in living standards of about 25%. And in the fourth decade, from 93 to 2003, there was an increase of about 30%. These are all reasonably impressive numbers. Even that 13% in the 73 to 83 decade wasn't too bad. Now think about those numbers and then think about what's happened over the last 10 years. The increase in British living standards over the last 10 years has been only 4%. So much, much weaker than we've seen in earlier decades. You might say, well, that's a peculiarly British story. Does it really apply to countries elsewhere in the Western world? And the answer is it does. In fact, it applies even more so to countries like Spain, and perhaps a little less so to countries like the US. But in broad terms, all countries in the West have been through a similar experience where the growth rates over the last 10 years have been really very disappointing compared with the past. Now, of course, the natural response to this is to say, well, this is all just a consequence of the global financial crisis. Once that's out of the way and we've healed ourselves from that particular crisis, then everything should be okay. However, the one country which often people think of as being the most dynamic of countries started to see growth ebbing away long before the onset of the global financial crisis. I'm thinking here of the US. So in the 1980s and 1990s, average annual growth in the US was about 3.4% each and every single year. A very, very impressive performance by the standards of the US itself, but also by the standards of other countries in the world in those 2 decades. Between 2000 and 2007, before the onset of the global financial crisis, a period of tremendous monetary and fiscal stimulus, very low interest rates, the Bush tax cuts, a housing boom, lots and lots of leverage, lots and lots of lending. During that period, 2000 to 2007, growth in the US averaged only 2.4%, so a full 1% lower than had been the case during the 1980s and 1990s. And since 2000 to where we are today, the average growth rate in the US has been less than 2%. Now people say to me, is there a risk of the Western world entering a Japan-style lost decade? My answer to those people is, we've already had a Japanese-style lost decade. The question now is there a chance of entering a second Japanese-style lost decade? A very different perspective, what people often think about. So those are the numbers. The question is, why has it happened? Is it just the financial crisis? Or are there other factors at work? What I'd like to argue is that for many of us, we've lived through a period of extraordinary gains in living standards, the like of which we've never really seen before. If you look at the growth rates in the second half of the 20th century, they were fundamentally stronger than anything we saw in the first half of the 20th century, which of course was scarred by wars and conflict, but also fundamentally stronger than throughout the 19th century, which was actually a relatively peaceful period, but also a period of tremendous industrial advance. After all, the Industrial Revolution got going in the 19th century, and yet the growth rates during that century were nothing like as strong as we saw in the period from 1950s to the late 20th century. What I'd like to argue is that beyond the wonders of technology, and I'm very much a technology optimist, I don't want to give the impression that somehow I'm suggesting that we've reached the end of the technology story, but beyond the technology story, there were other one-off factors which helped to lift growth to much higher rates than we had seen before, and much higher rates than we're likely to see in the years ahead. So what were those one-off factors? Well, the first one is really the opening up of world trade. The first half of the 20th century was a period of tremendous protectionism and isolationism. That all changed from the 1950s onwards. And there were really 2 revolutions in world trade that helped Europe and helped the US. The first revolution in the 1950s and 1960s was really the successive GATT rounds, the freeing up of trade in terms of reductions in tariffs and quotas. And you saw the most remarkable gains in exports during those decades. Japanese exports to the US were growing at 20% each and every single year. Phenomenal numbers that we really haven't seen since. The second revolution came in the 1980s and 1990s, and this was very much an East-West revolution associated with the reforms in China under Deng Xiaoping and also the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And that meant that China could trade with the US, and Germany could trade with Russia, and again, trade opened up dramatically. I would suggest that in the first half of the 21st century, there is the opportunity for a third trade revolution that doesn't really involve the Western developed world. The countries it really involves are those in Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. What I like to call the Southern Silk Road, the opening up of trade and capital movements that we really haven't seen for hundreds and hundreds of years. That is the next big revolution in world trade. It helps enormously those regions of the world, but it's not such a driver for what we're likely to see in the West. The second big change is women in the workforce. Back in the 1950s, very few women were working, and those that were working typically worked with relatively menial tasks. Thanks to the wonders of legislation, sex discrimination legislation and so on, the number of women involved in the workforce has risen enormously. But it should be regarded, in my view, as a kind of one-off adjustment in labour supply, a huge, rich vein of new labour coming into the labour market, adding enormously to activity, raising the growth rate for a number of years, until the point comes where the marginal additions are simply smaller arithmetically than was the case previously. So I think there'll be more opportunities for women to come into the workforce, but they're simply not as big as was the case over the period from 1950 through to the end of the 20th century. The third big driver was education. The massive spread of education, a wonderful thing over the last 60 or 70 years. But the consequence of this is that, if you like, at the margin, the benefits of education to the next person educated at university, they're gradually falling over time as more and more people are educated. I heard a story yesterday, a real tragic story really, of a Spanish woman who's now working in London. And she has a first degree and a second degree. And she's working in London as an au pair. In other words, the opportunities to get decent jobs as a consequence of very high levels of education appear to have faded, partly because of the numbers being educated, and also because of competition coming through from countries elsewhere in the world, from China, from India, from Brazil, and elsewhere. The fourth driver over that period was consumer credit, now rather a dirty phrase, of course, but very, very important, because the more that consumer credit grew, the more that we ended up with companies able to exploit economies of scale, more in the way of production, lower cost per unit of output. And this was a story that started really in the 1920s, but has really been a powerful driver in the 50s through to the end of the 20th century. Given the scope of the global financial crisis, I would wager that the chance of seeing quite such rapid growth in consumer credit in the Western world in the years ahead, those chances are much, much lower, largely because of changes in regulation, changes in assessments of risk, all things designed to prevent another global financial crisis from coming through. And the fifth factor, an obvious one, is demographics. Demographics are a hugely positive story. While the baby boomers were advancing through the population of working age, but as the boomers now advance towards retirement, we suddenly end up with Western economies with a kind of inverted population pyramid. Lots of people in retirement not producing very much, and very few people in work, with a tremendous burden imposed upon them to work for themselves and also for their parents. Numbers don't add up particularly well. So for all these reasons, I think we're faced with much lower growth rates than was the case over the last 60 or 70 years. Does that matter? Well, perhaps not in one sense, because after all, if you've got still rising living standards, why should we care? Well, the answer why we should care is because we got into that habit of making promises to ourselves over the last 30 or 40 years based on an extrapolation of those higher growth rates from the past. What we're now witnessing is a growing gap between the value of those promises and our actual economic achievements. And as that gap grows, the bigger is the risk that those promises will eventually have to be broken. So what are those promises? Well, the promises range from those in the public sector associated with pensions and healthcare, education, social benefits, promises of relatively low rates of taxation, all these promises being made, through to promises within the financial system associated with the promises between, say, creditors and debtors. And of course, this is particularly true within the Eurozone, where there are geographical differences between the Northern European creditors who want their money back and the Southern European debtors who, if they're going to repay that money, may be faced with year after year of austerity. Through to promises made within the corporate space, the corporate world, where chief executives have got used to the idea of massive salary and bonus increases because of their supposed brilliance in running their companies, even though their pay seems to not differ very much depending on whether the company is doing well or not so well at any particular point in time. So these promises exist. They're all built on the idea that growth will continue to be strong. But my question is, if growth is not quite so strong and the promises have to be broken, what does that mean for society? How should society think about those broken promises? And actually, this is an issue that I would say was first raised many hundreds of years ago by Adam Smith, one of the greatest economists. Going back to your question about Scotland, at least I can mention Adam Smith in terms of being a great Scottish economist. And Adam Smith, in 1776, when he published The Wealth of Nations, talked about three different states of economic nature, employing complicated econometric terminology, or not, as the case may be. He described these three states of nature as being, first of all, the progressive state, the idea of continuous economic expansion year after year after year, which he described as being a happy state of nature, through to the dull state, which we might describe today as being a period of continuous stagnation, and then through to the melancholy state, which was the idea perhaps of continuous economic contraction. And what he argued was that the progressive state was a desirable state, not just because people were getting better off, but because one person's gain would not be regarded as the reason for another person's loss. The chances were that everyone would make gains, even if the gains for some were greater than the gains for others. So in the progressive state, there was a sense that everyone could share in the spoils of economic success. Whereas in the dull and melancholy states, the danger was that one person's gain only came about as a consequence of another person's loss. And in those societies, suspicions would rise that one person's gain was deliberately the cause of someone else's loss. And if you're unsure within those societies where you are, whether you're a potential gainer or loser, you as an individual become increasingly risk-averse. You become increasingly worried about the potential losses that might come through eventually as a consequence of this stagnant society. But of course, if everyone is loss-averse, then the society becomes increasingly unwilling to take on risk, and the stagnation just builds year after year after year. And what I'd like to argue is that in the Western world, we've moved from the progressive state of the second half of the 20th century to something which looks closer to those dull and melancholy states. And that, I think, does create some significant difficulties. Now, what are the examples from the past of this shift from progressive states to dull and melancholy states? Well, in the book, I do mention two from the 20th century. The first and most obvious is Japan over the last 20 years. Now, Japan still has very high living standards. If you go back to a speech that Ben Bernanke, the current chairman of the Federal Reserve, gave in 2002, which was called Deflation, making sure it doesn't happen here, he has some interesting comments about Japan specifically. He said, well, one of Japan's problems is not just deflation. It's also the fact that in a society where there's no growth, it is very difficult to deliver the kinds of structural reforms that might eventually lead to a return to economic growth. Because in a dull or melancholy state, structural reforms necessarily create both winners and losers. And the losers will always oppose those structural reforms. But in the absence of the structural reforms, you end up locking in stagnation continuously year after year after year. So Japan is, I think, one example of this, although Shinzo Abe currently is trying to do something about that. Whether it will be successful is another matter altogether. The other much more extreme example, I think is a fascinating example, is Argentina. And Argentina is fascinating because in 1900, Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world. Its per capita incomes were remarkably high. In 1900, it had enjoyed 30 years of very, very rapid gains in living standards. And if you compared, say, Buenos Aires and Berlin in 1900, you might well have concluded that the options and opportunities for Argentina were significantly greater than they were for Germany. To be fair, in the first half of the 20th century, for fairly obvious reasons, they probably were better at the margin for Argentina than they were for Germany. But German living standards today are twice as high as they are in Argentina. And the issue is, what's the unusual story here? It's not Germany, because Germany's experience has been very similar to lots of other developed countries. The unusual experience actually is Argentina's, which has not seen the same gains in living standards. Why? Because I would say that back in the 1920s and 1930s, Argentina, faced with all the shocks associated with the aftermath of the First World War and the Great Depression, became an increasingly isolationist, protectionist country, which at the same time was desperately short of domestic savings. And at the same time, for the Peronists to win election after election after election, they made promises to the voters that they really had no right to make. Those promises were effectively bribes to the majority of voters, which could only be paid by robbing the minority, by effectively having financial crisis after financial crisis after financial crisis, by not respecting property rights, by effectively making life very difficult for the savers who necessarily were required to provide the savings for long-term investment. The long-term investment never happened, and Argentina stagnated. It became a society of suspicion, of mistrust, of tremendous political uncertainty. And it's an extreme example of what I'm talking about, a shift from a progressive state to a dull and melancholy state. You might say, well, that's all very well, but we have various tricks that you can use in the Western world to avoid these kinds of outcomes. And over the last few years, the tricks have been mostly used not by politicians, but by central bankers, because we increasingly like to believe that even though we have had weak growth, there is some magical monetary medicine that can be delivered that will turn us back to the growth rates of old, a bit more monetary stimulus, a bit more in the way of interest rate cuts, a bit more quantitative easing. All these kinds of things may eventually return us to decent economic growth. But in actual fact, these policies haven't worked quite as well as had been anticipated. In defense of these unconventional monetary policies, I would suggest that had we not had them, the Western world could be faced with another Great Depression. The US in particular could have been faced with another Great Depression back in 2009 after the failure of Lehman Brothers. Now, just to remind you of what happened in the Great Depression, because I think it is important to make the distinction. In the Great Depression, US real economic activity fell 30% in just 3 or 4 years. It was an amazing meltdown. Prices fell 20%, so there's massive deflation. So the value of economic activity in the US halved in just 3 or 4 years. The value of US economic activity today is significantly higher than it was back in 2007 or 2008. If you compare the US over the last 5 years with the period from 1930 to 1935, you'd have to say that these unconventional policies have been a resounding success. During the 1930s, 13,000 US banks failed. Very few US banks have failed over the last few years. So the stability of the financial system has also been upheld in a way that wasn't true back in the 1930s. So from that perspective, quantitative easing was extraordinarily helpful. It acted a bit like what I describe as a powerful antibiotic designed to cure a really, really nasty disease. But over the last 4 or 5 years, quantitative easing has shifted from being a powerful antibiotic into something which is much more like a kind of an addictive painkiller. It's nice to be on, it's difficult to escape from, but it comes with potential side effects. And these are the side effects I think that have been important. The first of these is that monetary policy has created winners and losers in perhaps an unexpected way. One way to characterize this is to think about what's been happening in the US in recent years. How was monetary policy supposed to work? The idea was it would drive up the value of financial assets like stocks and bonds. And by doing so, it allowed companies to raise funds through the capital markets without having to go through the banking system. So the idea was that the banks were, in some sense, broken or more cautious. Companies could still raise funds to invest. But companies have not invested. So the problem here is that Wall Street has gained significantly, and Main Street has lost out. It's not really the idea of quantitative easing in the first place. Secondly, it's created, I think, increased financial distortions. As stock markets have rallied, as corporate bond yields have fallen, it's created all sorts of questions about how we actually measure the allocation of capital. If you play around with interest rates for long enough, the danger is you end up with capital misallocation, which eats away at long-term growth. So you could say that monetary policy has reduced the downside risks in the short term, but only at the cost, perhaps, of a lower, longer-term growth rate than would otherwise be the case through this process of continuous capital misallocation. A third and important factor is that those countries which have had the opportunity to offer very loose monetary policy is that they've, in one sense, been able to avoid some of the tough structural fiscal reforms that Spain, for example, has been obliged to deliver over the last few years. In the short term, it's great news. But what happens if the process of loose monetary conditions allows governments to run with big budget deficits year after year after year, allows them to run bigger and bigger levels of government debt year after year after year? In those circumstances, what's really happening is a kind of model of financial repression where effectively the central bank colludes with the government to allow the government to raise funds on the cheap, but at the same time it starves the rest of the economy of funds, and therefore the private sector is unable to recover in the normal way. And then on an international basis, this monetary stimulus has also led to huge inflows of hot money into parts of the emerging world, whether it's India or Brazil or Indonesia, which has created instability in those countries, which ultimately is undesirable for long-term economic growth. So my conclusion, as far as quantitative easing is concerned and monetary stimulus is concerned, is that it represents in one sense the theological option for economic policy. It really boils down to praying for a strong recovery and hoping that monetary policy will be the answer to those prayers. But in reality, the growth rates that we've seen in recent years have been far below par, very disappointing, and certainly disappointing compared with the history of recoveries in the entire post-war period. So I don't think it really is the answer. And that suggests, again, we come back to this world of broken promises. Now, In the book, I was very keen to focus on history. And one reason for this is that as economists, we're very poor at thinking about history. We build these wonderful and clever economic models, mathematical models that pass all the relevant tests. They're things of statistical beauty. They're wonderful little models that work like clockwork. And we use these models based on 10 or 20 years of data, if we're lucky, to reach general conclusions about how economies operate. And then we're amazingly surprised when it turns out the models don't work very well. A typical economist conclusion, when the real world is different from the model, is to say there's something wrong with the real world, rather than something wrong with the model, which is a really strange way of thinking about how economies work. So in the book, I talked about some previous economic experience because I was particularly keen to highlight the connections between economic disappointment and political instability that might follow from this. And I wanted to use two examples. The first example, which is admittedly an extreme example, is the French Revolution. The second example, which is a much less well-known example, is the example of the UK in its austerity experience in the late 1920s, both of which I think have relevance for where we are in the Eurozone today. So the first example, the French Revolution, what I hadn't understood until I did the research for the book, is that according to de Tocqueville, who was writing about the French Revolution in the 19th century, that in the period from the 1750s through to the time of the Revolution, there had been really quite a sustained increase in living standards in France, a lot of urbanization, increases in technology, living standards rising relatively swiftly over an extended period of time. And this created the expectation of more increases in living standards to come. Everyone began to look forward to this wonderful new future, and then there were a series of shocks, mostly associated with bad harvests, associated with bad weather, which then forced up the price of flour and forced up the price of bread. Now, the consequence of this was that someone somewhere in France had to be worse off. But the clergy, the nobility, the monarchy said, not us. They didn't quite say we're the ancien regime, but they basically said, our living standards are God-given, why should we suffer? So, of course, they were not suffering. The so-called third estate, the workers, the artisans, the peasants, they were the ones who had to suffer given this economic setback. And, of course, the suffering that they went through sparked the French Revolution because, in one sense, it revealed that the people in charge were not representative of the interests of the public more generally. Now, this is a potentially controversial point, but I'd like to argue that in today's Eurozone, the equivalent of the third estate are those in southern Europe, not necessarily the governments, but the workers in southern Europe have been faced with a terrible economic shock which has been Eurozone-wide, but they're the ones who are in the brunt of the adjustment. Because the northern Europeans, effectively the equivalent of the monarchy, the clergy, and the aristocracy, basically saying, why should we suffer? We've done nothing wrong. We were only the people who lent money. We want our money back. We're innocent. It's those people in the south who made all the big mistakes. This is a very peculiar way of thinking about the world. And if I may say so, it's a very Germanic way of thinking about the world. My point about this is this. Germany takes pride in running a large current account surplus and has done for many, many years. I spoke to a German policymaker a few years back and said, what would you describe as the secrets of German economic success? And he said to me it was hard work and low inflation and being competitive and running a large current account surplus. I said to him, do you think that every country in the world should follow the same model? He said, absolutely. It should be hard work and low inflation and being competitive. And then, of course, he realized it's a little bit tricky for every country in the world to run a current account surplus, unless we do trade with Mars or Jupiter or some other planet in the solar system. The numbers just don't add up. And, of course, the reality is that for every current account surplus, there has to be an offsetting current account deficit. Now, the key point about the Eurozone in the years before the global financial crisis was that the money that flowed from north to south was not because people in the south wanted the money, it's because effectively those in the north forced that money upon them. And the reason for that was that in the years between 1999 and 2007, German excess savings, reflected in this large current account surplus, were channeled through the financial system into the purchase of southern European government debt, which drove yields down dramatically in southern Europe and effectively forced borrowers in southern Europe to borrow even more. If it had been instead those in Southern Europe who wanted to borrow more than the Northern Europeans wanted to lend, then Southern European interest rates would have risen quite a long way. But we didn't have that. We had exactly the opposite result. So I would suggest that one of the problems in the Eurozone today is that there is an unfair distribution of the losses associated with the Eurozone crisis. Unfair because the Southern European countries are faced with the brunt of the adjustment, and the Northern European countries are trying to avoid any adjustment at all. And that, I think, may have to change. My second historical example is that story from 1920s and 1930s, which is also relevant for the Eurozone today. And this relates to the UK. The UK rejoined the gold standard, which was the equivalent of the euro back in the 1920s, in 1925. And it joined at a very overvalued exchange rate. Winston Churchill, who happened to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, described this as the biggest mistake he made in his entire political career, joining at the wrong exchange rate. So effectively, the UK had an elevated, overvalued exchange rate, much the same as many Southern European countries have had over the last 4 or 5 years. And the consequence of this was that the UK had to deliver austerity year after year after year to try to make the numbers add up, to try to reduce the trade deficit, to persuade the UK's foreign creditors that indeed the UK would stay on the gold standard. So it's a very similar story to what we see in the Eurozone today. And the numbers worked for a number of years. But then in 1931, something happened which was a big surprise to the UK and, in fact, to other countries elsewhere in the world. There was the beginnings of the Great Depression. And one consequence of the Great Depression was that global demand for UK exports collapsed. And that collapse in demand for UK exports meant that the UK trade deficit widened dramatically. So what do you do under the gold standard with a trade deficit that's too big? You have to deliver even more austerity. So in September 1931, Philip Snowden, who was then the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK, announced an amazingly tough budget, even tougher than we've seen in Southern Europe. And this budget was designed specifically to keep Britain on the gold standard. It was designed to persuade Britain's international creditors that it was absolutely serious in making sure they made no losses in investing in Britain. And the Times of London, the newspaper, the day after the budget, wrote with tremendous enthusiasm about Britain's commitment to the gold standard, about Philip Snowden's brilliance and courage in committing to the gold standard, and the fact that from now on we could rest assured that Britain would stay on the gold standard forever. So it's somewhat surprising that 10 days later, Britain came off the gold standard. The question is why? What happened? And I just didn't know. The intention was to stay on. The result, we came off. What actually happened was that a couple of days after the budget was passed, there was something called the Invergordon Mutiny. Invergordon's a port in Scotland. Royal Navy ships came back to port 2 days after the budget was announced. The sailors picked up their newspapers and discovered that as a consequence of the budget, some of them would have to take pay cuts of between 10 and 25%. A combination of anger and probably for the sailors a bit too much rum led to a mutiny. It was a relatively small mutiny. But of course, once you had a mutiny, the game was up. It was impossible to stay on the gold standard because once the government had lost control of its military, there was no way in which it could really continue with the policies of old. The story began to fall apart very, very quickly indeed. My point about this is if you impose austerity continuously year after year after year, and then you have some kind of shock coming along, the risk is that the political story begins to unravel extremely quickly. Under those circumstances, you end up with the political story shifting so greatly that all the things we used to believe in begin to break up extraordinarily quickly. So, does that matter? Is it relevant for today? Well, it isn't relevant in one sense because what I think it means is this, that if you're faced with austerity year after year after year, you can reasonably say that faced with that austerity, there is likely at some point to be some kind of political upheaval. Of course, it's almost impossible to predict what that political upheaval might be. If I'd said in 1925 that I foresee that rejoining the gold standard will lead to the Invergordon Mutiny in 1931, you would say, I'm crazy. You couldn't possibly predict that. But if I'd said instead that the process of joining the gold standard would lead to such austerity that will lead to some threat of political instability, that might seem like a more credible warning for the future. And in fact, one person did warn of exactly that. It was John Maynard Keynes, the great British economist. He wrote a paper in 1925 called The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, and he warned precisely that delivering austerity year after year after year would probably lead eventually to some kind of political instability. He couldn't say what kind, but eventually came through. So why is this relevant? It's relevant because political instability often comes from broken political promises. And I think this is a really important issue for the Western world in the years ahead. What risks might come from this? The first risk is a move towards increased economic isolationism, a move towards isolationism, protectionism, a lack of engagement in the rest of the world, a sense that it's globalization that partly is to blame for the problems that we've had in recent years. And you can see it's beginning to come through in some political movements in different parts of the world. The Tea Party in the US is one example of it. The rise of the particularly toxic Golden Dawn Party in Greece is another example of it. The rise of the Front National in France is another example. The rise of the far right in the Netherlands is another example. The rise of the UK Independence Party is yet another example. Been a significant move towards populist politics, which is out of, if you like, the mainstream of political thinking over the last few years. That, for me, is potentially a worrisome development. Secondly, despite all the optimism about Spain currently, and I think it is to a certain degree justified, there are still enormous fault lines within Europe, fault lines really associated with the relationship between Northern European creditors and Southern European debtors. These fault lines are very difficult to remove, in part because the Eurozone, I would argue, is a half-finished project. Monetary unions tend to work because they're also backed by political and fiscal unions too. The history of monetary unions without political and fiscal unions is not a particularly happy history. So if you want the Eurozone to survive, I think there has to be a move towards some kind of political and fiscal union, and also probably a redistribution of losses away from the Southern European debtors towards the Northern European creditors. But getting the Germans to accept their responsibility in that particular story, I think, is proving to be incredibly difficult. It eventually may have to happen, but again creates tensions over the next few years. I think we're seeing tensions between the generations. If we're having a situation where growth is much weaker and there are competing claims in economic activity, how those claims resolve? Well, when we have aging populations in the West, it's very easy to protect the interests of pensioners and those who want to protect their healthcare interests, but that comes at a significant cost in terms of education for the young, retraining for the young, and also in some cases significant disruptive impacts on unemployment. How do you deal with that? So these are all, I think, tricky issues that have yet to be dealt with, but are all consequences of a continued period of lackluster economic growth, a world of broken promises. So, what can we do about this? What sort of reforms are required? And the good news here is that for all my pessimism, the final chapter of the book does end with some potential solutions, some options on how to deal with these problems. The first one, I think, is to recognize that creditor nations are themselves a source of instability. Again, John Maynard Keynes made this argument back in 1944. He recognized that in a world of imbalance of payments positions, it was always going to be the debtors that had to adjust, and the creditors would often emerge relatively scot-free. But I think if we're going to have a lasting stability in the global economy, we need to have some pain imposed upon the creditor nations as well as the debtor nations to stop them from investing in assets they don't properly understand. That might be, in my view, would be a good thing. Getting there is tricky, but maybe we need more international institutions to put pressure on those creditor nations to stop them from creating these financial bubbles in other parts of the world. And it's important because the German story over the last 10 years is now a Eurozone story. The Eurozone as a whole now runs a large current account surplus, which is creating financial instability in other parts of the world. A second big reform in those countries which have some flexibility in monetary policy, but which so far are doing very little to stabilize their longer-term fiscal position, like the US, for example. The US simply assumes strong growth in the future to avoid making tough political decisions. Those tough decisions will eventually have to come through. I'm thinking here of a repeat of the Graham-Rudman Act of the 1980s, a commitment to deficit reduction year after year after year. It's needed, but it's not there currently. And also there has to be an agreement between Democrats and Republicans on whether the US should be a high-tax, high-spending economy or a low-tax, low-spending economy. The Republicans want the low tax, the Democrats want the high spending. Getting that situation resolved is going to be very, very difficult. And in the meantime, we're likely to see more in the way of fiscal uncertainty, debt crises and so on coming through in the years ahead. I would like to see some kind of, I don't know how you're going to do this, but some kind of constitutional change which looks after the interests of the young as much as the interests of the old. Because voting systems in the Western world currently do not really achieve that particular result. What can be done constitutionally, perhaps through constitutional courts, supreme courts, to look after the interests of the young and avoid them having huge taxes and high debts to accommodate the interests of the old. Another big reform, tricky one to deliver, I think, but just at the point when we're seeing these populist parties coming through, it's actually the point where you need more, not less, immigration. Because immigration effectively boosts the ranks of the working age population and helps stabilize some of those pension dynamics which currently are so difficult. Another reform, raising the retirement age. Let's face it, we're all getting hopefully fitter and healthier than we used to be 30 or 40 years ago. When people reach the age of 60 or 65, does it automatically mean they should retire? Absolutely not. I think that pension age should be raised quite significantly to try to accept the fact that with the boomer generation coming into retirement, we simply cannot afford to look after people under current retirement rates. The banking system. Now, I work for a bank, and therefore you might think that I'm going to let banks off lightly. I don't think that should be the case. I've argued in my book that actually, in some cases, there was insufficient punishments for those who really did misbehave. There aren't that many people who misbehave dramatically, but those that did misbehave, I think, have lost trust in the financial system. And there should be ways of trying to rebuild that trust. If that includes fines, the removal of entitlements, the removal of pensions, perhaps in some cases prison sentences, so be it. Maybe that's what's required. And then finally, for my own profession, as an economist, I think our own profession has been really quite lamentable over the last few years. We have to really inspect what it is we got so badly wrong in recent years. Not everyone got it completely wrong, but enough people got it wrong to suggest that actually the profession is unimaginative, unable to think of what the risks might be, and too willing to believe in models that frankly have served us very, very poorly indeed. And what I would strongly argue is that economists going through university should spend a lot less time with their quantitative models, which might show that they're brilliant at maths, but not particularly good economic thinkers, and much more time focusing on the lessons of economic history. Because economic history is full of a rich vein of, in one sense, examples of hubris followed by nemesis, of booms followed by busts, of a belief that somehow we can conquer the economic cycle when in actual fact we never can. I'd like to finish with an observation from Gordon Brown, the former UK Prime Minister, who was previously the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK. He famously said a few years back that in the UK he promised there would be no more boom and bust. It turns out he was half right. So on that note, I'd like to thank you very much indeed. Thank you.